Let's Get To presents Go Go Astros, a focus on H-Town hardball.
And welcome back to Go Astros. Brian and Andy are here, and we're going to start off. We have to talk about the Beltran thing. And I know that people who have followed me in a myriad of shows have said, I think I've said about 18 times, I'm done talking about this. But what I noticed in the last bit of story, and it was a follow-up article in The Athletic about the Yankee letter, they're starting to lose detail in the national reporting of this. And I feel like for whatever we can do humbly to keep reminding people of the situation, we're going to do it. So Beltran says, you know what? If the management had said stop, I would have stopped. I don't know what he calls breaking a TV with a baseball bat, but Andy, overall, what did you think when you saw Carlos's?
I think, as I expressed to you and anybody else who asked me this past weekend, I'm so tired of talking about this, and I'm so tired of people like Michael Key bringing it up. I get who he's pandering to, and I really do understand that there is an audience that is still interested in having this conversation, but it is so remarkably boring because there's no new ground to tread. Beltran's going to try to make himself look as favorable as possible since he was the one player named, even though that's a technicality because he had been retired 2 years by the time they did an investigation. So for him to whine the fact, I'm the only player that got dinged on this. Well, no, because you had retired. You were actually serving as a manager at that point.
Right.
And as I recall, our manager got fired for it. So
yeah, that is what happened. AJ is gone because of it.
And Beltran got fired for it.
And
even as mismanaged as the Mets might have been under the Bullpens, do you really think they would have fired him if there wasn't some reason to? I don't think the Bullpens ever cared about PR.
No, they cared a lot about PR. They just weren't good at it.
Well,
they cared deeply about what's on the back page of the paper, and that was part of their problem as management. But that's a different story.
Good point.
Well, Brian, what did you? I mean, I got to get to the point where I get out of this. Well,
I have good news for you on that front, Jim.
Because
what was notable to me is how little reaction there was to it, either from the national media members that I follow on Twitter. That I think there was a initial story by James Wagner, initial tweet by James Wagner of the New York Times. It was retweeted once, and then there was the Evan Drellick story, and that was about it. And most of the national conversation among baseball guys yesterday and gals yesterday was about the various trades that went on yesterday and who was making the roster for opening day. It was essentially at the national level a footnote, and if you weren't paying close attention, you may have missed the story. It was very different in sort of Astros and Yankees Twitter, and for obvious reasons. But as a national story, it seems to have gone down. And it speaks to something we haven't heard a lot this spring training. We haven't heard a lot of stories about booing or people reacting to the sign stealing scandal. My sort of reaction to this is I want to be like these national people. They're getting past it. That means I can try to get past it.
But Andy, what about my utter desire to defend the truth at all costs?
Does it matter? I mean, honestly, you can.
My wife's been having this conversation with me for 22 years. I don't know if it matters. I'm just saying.
If you want to be Don Quixote, you can tilt at that windmill all day long, but it doesn't ultimately matter because people have made up their minds about what happened, up to and including the mental gymnastics of assuming that the Astros were the only team who was doing anything. They are the only team that got caught and punished to the level that they did. And believe it or not, a team that doesn't spend at the top end of the payroll allotment, losing 2 first-round draft picks and 2 second-round draft picks, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
I know there's not a financial ramification, but you talk about having I think it came out this week, the number 29 farm system out of 30. That's a direct result of missing those 4 draft picks who should have been some of your higher end prospects, even at low A and high A at this point. So yeah, I mean, you can keep talking about it, but it just doesn't. Nobody cares. They've made up their minds as to what it is, and there's nothing that's going to happen. There's nothing that's come out. The letter could be revealed and read out loud today, and it could say the Yankees have been cheating not only starting in 2015, but all the way back to their beginning, and they still do it, and they don't care. They keep thumbing our noses, and we've actually subsidized their cheating, and no one would care.
All right. Well, I guess that means we can move on from this topic.
Well, I just add this point to, I feel like last year we spent a lot of time saying, hey, here's what the facts are. Here's what the context is. We sort of kept coming back to that, there's bigger things here. We also know from Tony Adams' really great research of finding what all the bangs are and other people who analyze what it is. We know who did it when. We also know it didn't have that much effect. And we know they weren't doing it in the 2017 playoffs, not because they had a streak of morality. It's because it was too loud to hear.
Right. But I think that
again,
point, though, Brian, is what had my Irish up last week, because in one of the footnote articles I talked about, they said, oh, and they cheated all through the playoffs and that helped them win. And I'm like, no, that's actually not. Okay. Sorry. Continue.
Yeah.
But that's what that's what they believe. Yeah. There's nothing you can show them. You could show them all the data and the facts. They're not going to go, oh, I guess I was wrong. No one does that anymore.
These people believe that Jose Altuve wore a buzzer, which there's absolutely no evidence for. Part of that is that we know he was one of the guys not using the system in 2017, in part because he may have been using it at the beginning just a little bit and said, it's not working for me. I don't like it. Please don't do it. And they stopped doing it for him. So did he pick that up in 2019? That seems unlikely, right? Based on sort of the other evidence. Yeah, but hey, but Aaron Judge is covering up as he's rounding the bases, and well, him believing conspiracy theories has had no impact on public health, fortunately. So, complete opposite
that you're aware of.
Enjoy not playing in Toronto, Aaron.
Yeah, that you're aware of. All right, well, let's talk a little. We'll talk some actual on the field stuff. I hate, the report said that Beltran says we're behind the times and now he's a victim.
But Beltran's not a credible witness. He's literally defending his own legacy, and there's got to be this ability to decide that the veracity of somebody's words is real. There's no veracity to the things that he's saying. There's no truth to the things he's saying, other than agreeing with Michael Key, because Michael Key has a predisposed set of outcomes that he wants to hear about.
Right.
More importantly, is an employee of the Yankees working on the Yankees' own network. This is Carlos, you have to do this as a condition of you being an analyst this year. But once you do that, we'll stop talking about it. You can get back to getting your reputation back. We'll get back to getting really good analysis of baseball. Please tell us who's tipping pitches when you're calling a game, because we all want to know that.
Okay. Well, let's talk about pitches for a second. Brian, you had an article on Substack that I think talks a little bit about the bullpen. And for me, I think that this is maybe, and I'm going to use the word worst it's all relative, right? But this is probably the least stacked Astros team we've seen in this run, right? Like, I think from 17 to now, this is probably the one with the most question marks. What are some of the concerns that you guys have about the bullpen, if any? Brian, you can go first.
Sure. I kind of think, my impression of the offseason is they were going to sign one more bullpen arm, and there are a couple you can identify that, they certainly had the chance to do that. They didn't. And, there's a couple reasons for that. I think the biggest is they lack flexibility in the bullpen to send guys down. They get a little break on that with the 28-man roster in April, but they've got very few players who have options to be sent down to the minors. So if they have a 15-inning game and they need an extra arm the next day, they're a little sort of compromised on how to do that. By the way, you can only have 13. Once we get to May 2nd, you only have 13 pitchers on the roster, so you can't even burn a position player spot.
And they've extended the mandatory IL stint, so that way you really can't do that as much anymore.
Yeah.
Anyway,
there's been a clear attempt in several things to sort of reduce your ability to, essentially have a 27, 28-man roster that a lot of teams have taken advantage of. So the two most interesting arms in the bullpen who I think could make leaps this year. One is Phil Maton, has a lot of promise, And it finally started paying off with an excellent performance in the postseason. I think he had 14 Ks and 3 walks, one of them intentional, in the playoffs. He reworked his slider once he came to Houston, and if that's a level up from Phil Maton, that would be a really big boost to the bullpen. The other is Rafael Montero, who, when they got him last year, I thought it was just for sort of salary reasons to stay under the to be able to get rid of Joe Smith's salary. They had to take on a similar salary, but they seem to have a lot of faith in him. And if you look at his StatCast numbers, it's much more promising than you think. He doesn't have a huge whip rate, but he doesn't give a lot of strong contact. He seems to have been really hurt by the Mariners defense, and good news for Montero, he gets a better defense behind him. And for what it's worth, he had 6 innings and didn't give up an earned run in Houston last year before he got hurt. So I don't know that that's the real Rafael Montero, but
yeah. Well, the eyeball test for him, he looked electric. I mean, I thought, I don't know, I was actually excited about the pickups. I did think there was potential. I mean, Andy, where is your sort of comfort level going in when we have to hand the ball to the bullpen in the 5th or 6th inning to start the season?
Bullpens are crapshoots. Bullpens are crapshoots every year. And with all apologies to any statistical analysis that's going to be applied to the bullpen we have, there's a reason these guys are in bullpens, with the exception of probably the closer role. They are guys who have a limited pitch selection to throw from. They generally aren't great with control, or they don't throw real hard, or there's something that they're lacking. So year to year, it's really hard to say this guy is going to be fantastic for the next 3 years. Year to year, you might have a great bullpen, you might have a bad bullpen, you might have guys that you're counting on that aren't going to perform, and vice versa. So we've got arms. They seem to fit a profile that the Astros are comfortable managing and using and teaching. Bringing up Montero, I think, is a good example of that. Part of the excitement from the Astros front office was that they saw a lot of things that they could use and teach him with the skills he already had, especially from a spin rate perspective, to be more effective, similar to what they did with Ryan Presley, similar to what they started doing with Phil Maton later in the year, where you saw it really start taking hold in the playoffs. I think his move from Cleveland to Houston, there was a lot of adjustment period to stop throwing that pitch, throw this pitch or these pitches in this situation. And I think it finally got to the point where he was comfortable doing that. So I think there are pieces there. I think that you'll see limited movement, to Brian's point, because we just don't have a lot of guys who can go up and down anymore. So the idea of Josh James is probably an exception, because I think he still has options, but the idea of
he's been sent down already. So yes.
Yeah, but him being
Josh James has been on the Astros for 15 years. How does he still have options?
Him being shuttled back and forth between Sugar Land and Houston that's not going to be the norm of what we've seen in especially with the 28 games and 27 days streak that we have somewhere in the middle of the season. It's gonna hurt unless we have one of those years where everybody in the bullpen seems to put it together. Bullpens are a crapshoot, and you can have all the stars aligned, it might not work out, but it might. So
yeah. Seattle had this great bullpen last year, made up of guys who were failed starters and released in other places, and where they came from or how they got there is sort of a mystery. And they're also not projected to have that great a bullpen this year, despite having a bunch of those guys still there, in large part because their history matters in those projections. Will that play out? I don't know. I drafted one of the Seattle guys in a fantasy league this week, so I'm assuming not.
Well, and I think that's a really good point. Not necessarily with the Mariners, but you look at the Rays, and one thing that James Click does have is experience with a franchise or an organization who can put together strong bullpens out of leftover parts. They look for a profile of a guy, not necessarily the results of the guy, and they try to get them to pitch the way they want him to pitch. And I think Click is putting that kind of system in with the Astros. And so, maybe that's going to be his strength. I think it's still weirdly too early to tell on James Click, because he hadn't had to do a whole lot. And I know,
you bringing up the lost draft picks earlier. I mean, that's a good point. He hasn't really had a draft yet, it's his 3rd year as the GM.
So it's, he has experience working for a franchise that puts together strong bullpens year after year. That I think is a positive in the Astros' favor. So hopefully it continues here. And he did make really shrewd moves at the trade deadline to take what was a weak bullpen and strengthen it up for the playoffs. And that was a big reason that we advanced all the way to the World Series.
And worth noting, one of those moves was taking your starting center fielder and saying, I have better players than him or the equivalent players to him in AAA. And if I move him, I will get, and so, people ask me what's James Click's best move with sort of this, he hasn't done a lot. And I'd say it's that one. It's, moving from Miles Straw to Jake Myers, because his evaluation of how he was doing at AAA and what Chas McCormick would be, were absolutely spot on.
Yeah, I mean, it's wrong. You're right. It's to say that it's hasn't done anything. He hasn't really had to do the big things.
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct.
Well, and I think, Andy, I think you and I have talked privately. We both think James Click is doing a good job, but there is that percentage of Astros fans who don't think he's doing a good job because there hasn't been a JV or a Greinke or that kind of thing, and it is unfair.
Well, I mean, the nature of the Astros job is that Jim Crane's going to take the high profile contract negotiations. So I know a lot of fans want to pin Carlos Correa or George Springer on James Click. We were never going to re-sign Springer. That was not going to be a thing. So that's not on Click.
Thanks, Jeff.
And Correa was absolutely Jim Crane's job to complete. And for whatever reasons we've talked about here, it didn't happen. But the smaller pieces of building a team, I think James Click is very competent at. And when the Astros start having real needs, because they really haven't had needs while he's been here, to make big position player moves or big starting pitcher moves, the jury's still out on how he's going to be. But I think the things he's been asked to do, he's been very competent at.
I want to ask two more pitching questions. First of all, I've been reading a lot of articles, and there is the opinion that we shouldn't see much of a drop-off from losing Brent Strom to the two guys that he's sort of been grooming. And, I'm also of the opinion that sometimes getting younger, fresher blood in there is actually a good thing to maybe improve some of the stuff that you've been doing to evaluate and strengthen pitchers. Where are you guys on that? I mean, do you feel like why are you laughing at me?
Younger, fresher blood under Dusty Baker, who is 106.
I feel attacked this episode. I'm going to go to my safe space. But no, are you worried about the loss of Strom, Brian, or is that a much ado about nothing?
I mean, short answer is yes. Long answer is, hey, these are really promising. Murphy and Miller are really promising guys who've come up through the system, who have learned at the feet of Brent Strom and have advanced in an organization that's really good at developing pitching. So it's not like they didn't beat out it's not like they didn't beat out nobody to advance within the Astros organization. And so, there's reasons to be, it's similar, though not the same scale as Correa to Pena. There's reason to be hopeful about the young guys, but why go to the young guys when you've got the proven guy who's done it before? So, I hope this works out. I have optimistic reasons to believe it will work out. It's also sometimes hard to tell what effect a pitching coach has, particularly, 6 weeks in the season, if they have a bad stretch. Is that the pitching coach's fault, or just bad things happen?
Yeah.
I don't know, but we'll yell about it on social media because, of course.
Andy?
Well, it's always the hitting coach's fault when your hitters don't hit, right?
True.
In the box swinging the bat for them. I am dubious of the effect that the change is going to have. I think certainly there's going to be some piece, because I think Strom's strength was, once he built his system, getting pitchers to buy into it. I don't think any of the three of us know who really was having those conversations, if it was completely Strom or if it was the two guys who've worked super closely under him for the past few years, continuing to reinforce those conversations. And if that's the case, I don't know how much drop off you're going to have. I think ultimately our pitching staff is as successful as Dusty Baker allows it to be. And that's going to seem like a weird statement, except that I still am not convinced, after his 30th year of managing Major League Baseball teams, that he knows how to manage a bullpen. And until he learns how to manage a bullpen, I think it's always going to hold the teams he manages back. I think he's gotten better, but he still has the hitter's approach to pitching.
Yeah, and I when I think about Dusty Baker and pitching decisions, I still go back to pitching Lance one day early when he didn't have to. And I mean, I think we're still dealing. And I'm on record as I was never a fan of that decision when it happened. And then you learn that, yeah, it was that he had lifted the day before, and I mean, you know what I mean. So I don't know. I feel like they did not make the best decision in that particular instance, especially when they scored 10 runs and would have won anyway.
I think the other thing, so I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think
No,
the
it's
other
okay.
thing is having Justin Verlander back as the veteran in the rotation, even if he's only going 5 innings and only pitches every 6 days because we're trying to get him back up to full strength. His leadership and his ability and desire to share his knowledge with young pitchers, I think, is a big, big deal that we didn't have last year.
I mean, just imagine if you would have tweeted at those guys last year, right? Wasn't that the difference between winning and losing? Because JV didn't say good luck, guys, at Bregman. No,
I do think there would be some value of him showing up every now and then and saying, "Hey, I watched your last game. Here's some things you might want to think about." And maybe he did that in private. I have no idea, but that's something that he's going to be able to do that I don't think Zach Greinke is really the guy who is delivering that message.
Sure.
And I think Zach Greinke probably delivered a lot of messages, but I think they were really, really blunt. Maybe Framber Valdez didn't want to hear them that way, or, whatever. I think JV's got the stature, got the skins on the wall, and has the ability to communicate and get on people's level, that I think that's a help with losing Brett Strom, that you have another guy there that these younger pitchers can turn to. And to that extent, Odorizzi as well. I think he's a guy that likes to share knowledge, and I think he's a really good teammate, even if he's not necessarily a big fan of the management in Houston right now.
Brian, anything you want to add on that before my next query?
Yeah, I think just Verlander has the personality and persona. Almost sort of that Verlander is almost this sort of character at some level, particularly if you're like a 23-year-old pitcher. He's been pitching all your life. He's been larger than life in a way that Zach Greinke, who is going to the Hall of Fame as well, isn't. And, if I'm a 20-year-old pitcher in the Astros camp this year, I think my goal is I want to see what Justin Verlander does every day and try to do exactly that. And I don't even think you need to be, whatever Justin Verlander says to me I'm going to do. I'm just going to go do what he does. And hopefully when I'm 39, they'll be handing me $25 million contracts too.
It's not dissimilar to the only article that Chandler Rome's ever written that I thought was actually good. His profile of Yuli and its effect on the Cuban players. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. 2 more questions before we get out of here. One, obviously the Astros' strength right now, I think, is starting pitching. Who do you think at the trade deadline, if we've got to move somebody, which of these guys do you think gets moved? Andy, we'll let you go first.
There's a lot of different paths and variables to this. I think the player that's probably most attractive that we would be willing to move, and the player that we would like to move that's less attractive, are 2 different guys. But I think that if you're looking at who we have available, Christian Javier is somebody that you could move. Jose Urquidy is somebody that you could move and have people excited about getting him. And then Jake Odorizzi is somebody you'd like to get rid of the salary on at some point. And that's nothing to say against anybody's performance, because I think Odorizzi is going to have a good year. I hope so.
Yeah.
I think Urquidy is probably in the prime of his career based on whatever age he actually is. The guy looks like he's 50.
He does.
He may be only 28, whatever, but he looks like
this is why I like him so much.
But he also, he has performed in the playoffs. He's performed in high leverage situations. He is relatively young, but he's also kind of at the top of his skill set. So I think that if you're looking at somebody that could fetch something you actually need besides a salary dump, I think he's probably your prime candidate. I don't see the Astros getting rid of Garcia unless it's just an incredible offer. Verlander's not going anywhere. Framber's not going anywhere. Nobody wants Lance McCullers right now because you don't know when he's going to pitch and he's not going anywhere either because he's going to be buried in the H or something. Sell a t-shirt.
No one wants the contract. No one wants that contract until he's healthy.
So, I think your candidates are Odorizzi and Javier and Urquidy. And of those, the most likely to me to get you a good return is Urquidy.
Brian?
Yeah, I'm not sure they're going to be interested in trading any of the starting pitchers. except for Odorizzi. And actually, the key to Odorizzi is two things. One, Lance McCullers' health, and broadly the health of the pitching staff in general. If, Jake Odorizzi, you think for the back half of the season is your number 7 starting pitcher, he's probably more useful somewhere else. And two, the big key, I think, on Odorizzi is our top pitching prospect, Hunter Brown, and how he does down at AAA. If he looks at the end of the season like he's ready for a call up, if he's actually the 6th or 7th best starting pitcher on the staff, then you can have comfort trading Odorizzi. Right now, with McCullers out, with a guy coming back from Tommy John at the top of your rotation, and the fact that every pitcher is an injury risk at every single moment, having 7 quality starting pitchers is helpful and a good piece of depth to have. And actually, one thing to sort of look out for in the beginning of the season is how they treat Christian Javier. And are they able to sort of keep him stretched out in sort of long appearances? Do they have a good plan for that? Which they never really were able to execute well last season. But the Astros played a surprisingly low number of close games last season. That's part of the reason for that. And for Ryan Presley's relatively low save total.
Well, it also goes back to the conversation about Dusty Baker and his bullpen management, because you'll look, and you may get to experience this year. I get super frustrated when I look and they bring somebody in and Blum starts talking about, oh, we haven't seen him in about 10 days. And you start looking and there's this pattern of usage where guys get 10, 15 days off in the middle of the season for no reason. Meanwhile, you're beating Presley into the ground and having him pitch four out saves, 5 out saves. And a couple of other favorite pitchers that Dusty gets attached to, and he forgets that he's got 15 pitchers sitting in the bullpen.
And I do think, and Andy, you know this, his use of Javier I was pulling my hair out last year. Criminal. It was, he should have been, to Brian's point, your pitcher gets blown up, we need 3 or 4 innings guy, not your come in for an inning and then that's all you get. It was awful.
And that inning was every 3 or 4 days. I mean, that's the problem. If you're going to keep him stretched out and you don't have a 4-inning opportunity for him, he needs to pitch every day or every other day. The usage has to get distributed in a better way to keep those pitchers more effective at the end of the year.
Yeah.
I'll just propose this sort of relatively ideal sort of scenario is in
Dusty
game
Baker
1.
retires today.
There's that. Number two, in game 1, Thursday night in Anaheim, you get 5 from Fromber, and then you put your 4 best relievers in for an inning. Win 4-2, handshakes and high fives. Come back the next day, we get 4 or 5 from Odorizzi, and then you bring in Javier, expecting you get 2 to 3 from him, bridge you to the late innings. And that one we can win by 8 or 9 because the Angels usually run out of steam after game 1 most seasons.
Well, I guess that leads us to the next thing. I mean, this is the last episode we'll have without real actual baseball to discuss. I have the Astros winning 95 games. I have them winning the AL West. I have them making the ALCS, but I am not going to upset the baseball gods by predicting anything further than that. But I do see 6 straight ALCS appearances. Andy, you?
About 93 wins, win the division. Haven't given a lot of thought to the playoffs because the playoffs are so dependent on the matchups and who's hot at this point. They are certainly a team that should get out of, assuming they have one of the best 2 records and they get the bye, because I think there's a bye. I'm not familiar with what the new playoff rules are, and somebody might get a draft pick, or the all-star team or all-star game result might determine where they play their games. I know we're going to have a series in Milwaukee randomly in the year because of a hurricane in Florida or something. There's a lot of things that could happen. Bud Selig is going to take another tour of being the commissioner just for fun, see how else we can punish the Astros franchise. They should win whatever their first round matchup is, because I think that's where their talent is. If that's the wild card or if that's the division series, great. Beyond that, it's really dependent on who the matchup is and who's hot at that point, and what we've done to develop or come up with a center fielder.
Ryan.
let's see, they won 95 games last year. They're downgrading 3 wins at shortstop from Correa to Pena. So I'll say 92 wins, which still wins the American League West.
All right. Well, guys, like I said, we'll have actual baseball to discuss. We will have seen Justin Verlander again by next time. We'll see, of course, Framber and Odorizzi. So until then, guys, go Stros.
Go Stros.
Go Astros, break camp.